I'm Edgar Kramer from SoundStage Australia. I want to start off by thanking Tony Stantos, I'm not sure where he is, and Nick Pappas for providing the venue for an evening with Bill Lowe from AudioQuest. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you.
Bill, I wanted to start off by asking you, I once heard you talk about the act of immersion, okay, when listening and experiencing music. And I also heard you refer to it as getting high on music. I refer to it as a kind of surrendering. Can you share further thoughts about the immersion in the context of an audio system? How do you become immersed with music?
It's tiny acknowledgement first of your comment about getting high. The music is arguably the world's most popular recreational drug, something that people take voluntarily for entertainment that affects your mood and your internal brain chemistry every bit as much as, not in the same way, but as much as weed or alcohol or other drugs. And you could even argue it's addictive to an extent, at least for those of us who spent our life pursuing the reproduction of music. Immersion is, to me, where it all starts. Most of today's audiophiles, speaking from my experience, and can't speak for you, started out with, depending on your age, large bookshelf speakers. It's amazing the things they used to call bookshelf speakers. On either side of a sofa, essentially meaning that whoever was sitting on the sofa was giant headphones. Yeah, complete immersion. I myself did not have an audio system in an audiophile triangle until I went into business in retail and set up the systems that I was offering that way, because in my own one-bedroom apartment next door, or studio apartment, I carefully positioned two speakers to have a amplitude balance. If I was in bed, or if I was at my desk, or if I was in the kitchen, I filled the space with sound. That was my priority.
Sure.
But I slightly more or less equilateral triangle that I like, and the image specificity that I and many audiophiles prize was not actually where I started, and is not where most people who've become audiophiles start. Becomes, well, you could say we started as 6-year-old kids dancing around, not even to the beat, just music is stimulating and the kid dances around. And then somewhere, I used to say age 12 to 14, 10 to 12 today, things happen earlier. There's a beginning to be a relationship of my music and curating the soundtrack to one's life. And one can do that without ever pursuing what we pursue in terms of the astonishing sensuality and sort of presence of the music as enabled through a better hi-fi system. Because that is not a requirement. That is an additional attribute. But I deeply regret that our industry refers to that goal as the reason to care, and then shuts off the other 95% of the population from ever giving a damn about what we do, because we look like a cult speaking in tongues about how sound is supposed to sound real. The musicians are in the room with you. And we know what we mean by that there's a vector between just grossly unbelievable and maybe, if you wanted to believe and consider that to be important, you could. But no hi-fi sounds real. So if that's when we tell people that the purpose of good hi-fi is to sound real, they have good reason to just laugh at us.
Yeah.
But again, immersion is what you asked about. I'm just saying that all of those details that I do prize, image specificity, and when I describe listening on my Rockport Cygnus speakers to the soundtrack to White Lotus season 3, and there's something happening 30 meters over there and 20 meters over there and 10 meters high. It's an incredible soundscape. And it takes a good 2.0 system to do that. Multi-channel can never do it as well because it's too literal.
Yeah.
The imagination, the most pure relationship we have to reality is actually the one we imagine. Our dreams are more real than our interface is with the real world.
Would you say it's a mix of instinct and imagination, and just purely engaging with a beat, with a musical beat?
Well, that's where the soundtrack to White Lotus, as long as I'm mentioning it, had me sort of scratching my head and bothering my wife when I'd say, "Did you hear that?" And she'd say, "What are you talking about? I'm paying attention to the story." But I can't stop not being stimulated by just the oral stimulation of such a good soundscape. But it doesn't have a beat in that case. It doesn't qualify as what I would call music. And yet I'm turned on by it in exactly the same way, by the same hardware that I've been curating all my life. It's completely in sync. So am I really just an oral stimulation junkie? Or is it about the music? Or there's no point in separating them.
Or are you getting high on the music? That's right. Yeah.
And the word for getting high is, I read something today where there's a reference to flow and about teaching children. So whether it's flow or as one, or I like to say, are you walking or are you flying? We often refer to things in the world and the quality of one piece of a gear or speaker compared to another as if they're steps on a ladder. And there is a hierarchy, and you can kind of stuff things into plateaus on a ladder. But the human experience is much more binary. It's much more, you're outside and you don't care, it's background music, or you are as one with the music and in that space on that mountaintop, and you're naked in front of the music.
True.
Which was so much easier to do when we were younger, because growing up, maturity, after about age 25 in particular, in terms of neurology, we sort of lose the ability to just let go on demand. Which is good, because otherwise you have a lot more car accidents and a lot more problems with all those young people. We never grew up.
It comes back to the concept of that I mentioned. For me, it's a kind of surrender. And you were talking about immersion as well. So all those psychological aspects, I guess.
Well, immersion is the goal. Image specificity and other audiophile attributes, referring to the tonality and can I tell whether it was a Bosendorfer piano or a Steinway or a Yamaha? Like, who cares if it sounds good?
Yeah, exactly. If you're engaged, you're engaged.
But so those are details, and they're relevant to the extent that they facilitate emotional immersion. That's the goal.
Sure.
And I refer to the audio equipment as the emotional transportation. There's emotionally provocative software, which starts in the head of a composer, the head of the musician who might have practiced and noodled around and come up with the way they choose to play it. When they sit down to play it, they're in a sense playing out a file. It's an analog file rather than a digital file, but they're playing out a file. And every live performance is a rendering, of which no two are the same. But they're all the same music, but maybe they don't make quite as good a connection. One Chopin sonata played by one musician and played by another pianist. It doesn't mean that they're all equally effective at connecting to the individual or the audience and the air in the room, and are we hungry, or how many drinks did you have before you sat down? That's all in the mix. So every live performance is itself a rendering, and no two are the same, and that doesn't. Some of them are bad, but there's more than one right. There are many versions of right.
Sure.
And the same for reproduced music through speakers and electronics. We've captured, as best we can, a rendering, and that becomes the source for a re-rendering, no two of which will be the same based on the physiology and psychology of the individual at the time they're listening, and whether it's a group dynamic or individual at the time of day.
Sure.
All those other ingredients, the room. No two are alike. Many of them, you might say, are wrong, and many of them are right. So thinking linear in a linear fashion about what is success in audio is maybe the first mistake that happens in the way that our industry communicates to the people who have not yet joined and understand why it is that we're here and we care so much.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, Bill, this is a more practical question. So it would be fair to say that AudioQuest is going to be one of the largest cable manufacturers in the industry. What do you consider the crucial factors that led to the growth of AudioQuest from its inception to where it is today?
Well, the germ, the seeds, are growing up at a time where disproportionate percentage of people were attracted to music, the creation of music. I like to use, just as a total made-up example, at a different generation, Jimi Hendrix might have been a software engineer or a nuclear physicist. Many musicians are very good at mathematics, and I think the most capable people that help move civilization forward are people who can build bridges and could have done more than one thing in terms of what they specialized in. And the evolution of Western music, again, I'm limited by my orientation and my background, and I can't speak for what it would have been like to grow up in China or someplace else in the world.
Okay.
But the British American, which also includes Australia and Canada and South Africa, version of sort of musical history and interplay, drove my life. And using the Black population in the United States is a significant driver.
Yeah.
Jazz and blues very much came from that population. And in the 50s, the transition from a Frank Sinatra and a Perry Como into Buddy Holly and on into Motown and such. Early Beatles, early Stones. Stones was a blues group.
Yes.
That was a repertoire of 50, 75 years of very sophisticated music coming out of a repressed community that came into the popular culture. People who were as white as you could be, Pat Boone, material was taken from that culture. There's this fuel, this fire.
Yes.
And so that growing up inside of that, you can't see what you grew up. A kid who's playing stickball on the street doesn't necessarily know how underprivileged they are because they're having a great time. As a kid, you just grew up in it. And so I grew up in a world where, have you heard the new? Referring to the new Peter, Paul and Mary recording, the new Ventures, the first albums I ever bought. Have you heard the new Beatles? And they really went through a heck of a progression.
Yes.
Most of the more successful groups in the history of popular music kind of develop a shtick. And then it becomes, sometimes it's their prison, because the audience wants to hear what they've heard before.
Yeah.
And boy, sometimes the artist, like, I went to a Lou Reed concert at the Roxy, and he was just on fire against playing Walk on the Wild Side for an encore one more time.
Yeah.
Which is a totally cool song that I used to sell a lot of hi-fi.
Yeah.
So inside of that sweep of culture, I lived in that world, and so did a lot of other people who started hi-fi companies, because music was important.
Yeah.
And why it was important, I could not explain. It was a gut feeling. My father once sat down and offered that I should play him some music and show him why I cared so much, why was music so important to me. And I played a song that to me is really, nothing will ever beat it for just an evocative short, what you can do in 2.5, 3 minutes to evoke an emotional state. And it's Buffalo Springfield, For What It's Worth, which some of you might be old enough to remember. I don't know. Came before Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. And just that there's something happening here. Just that the tone, the music, the poetry, without being specific about what it might have been written about.
Yeah.
Was just this, the air I breathed. It was my generation.
Sure.
Kids, as they grow up, they always go through a transition. I made reference to the mime music. Except the mime music might be like a sort of a 2-year period today. But at that time, the language of popular music was changing so fast for about a 15-year period that it was like prolonged adolescence, which was a term that came to be popular at that time. Kids who wouldn't leave college kept smoking dope and listening to hi-fi.
Getting high again.
And joining a band, whatever. So my progression of building speakers, the wood was free at the shop at school, building speakers for other kids, buying speakers that were $29 for a 12-inch 3-way Utah driver, 2 for $30, putting them in cabinets. They sounded actually pretty good in the day, building dyna kits and Heath kits for $5, $10 a piece to get the money to buy records.
Yes.
I mean, it was just, this is just what I did.
Sure.
It wasn't a plan.
Right.
It was just a way of life. And then I never grew up and got a real job. I just kept selling hi-fi, kept making hi-fi. And it was when I started, I should go back to the beginning of cable. was nothing serious. It was that I gave away 14 gauge, a reasonable lamp cord, 2.08 square millimeter, electrical wire with every pair of speakers that I sold in the 70s in my little apartment-only store in Portland, Oregon. And a funny story that came out of that, the only person who refused the free cable was an electrician.
Okay.
And he said, "Oh, I've got plenty of wire. I don't need to take your wire. Thank you anyway." And then he called about 2 days later and complained at how bad the system sounded.
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out that because he was an electrician, this is one of the ironies about knowledge and how knowledge is both an enabler and a prison when it's misapplied. Because my saving grace as a cable designer was that I had no knowledge to misapply. I was a history major and a scientist in the sense that I experimented, but I had I got it figured out. I'll just do this.
Sure.
And knew nothing. I was open. I was a exploring scientist. So this electrician had used like a 22 gauge cable because from a safety point of view, a 22 gauge cable can carry enough current to blow up your speakers.
Yeah.
So why would you need more?
So it's enough. Yeah. That's it. Yeah.
So even the cable naysayers will say the only thing that matters is gauge, and you need a cross-sectional area that's adequate depending on how far you're going, and the damping factor for the amplifier and the Q of the loudspeaker. They'll say that that's all that matters. Mm-hmm. Well, the electrician was several steps back from that, knowing that you only needed a tiny cable to carry the tiny amount of current that we actually use to drive a hi-fi. I just find an interesting irony in that. Sure. Because when people ask I was embarrassed for the majority of the history of AudioQuest. It wasn't until 2012 that I hired Garth Powell, someone who knows all kinds of things that I would never know, who even then could only design cables on top of my foundation because I had empirically come up with variables that were more fundamental than the ones that he was aware of as a professional engineer. Sure. And musician. Yes, like he'd prefer to say that he's a drummer, jazz drummer, and the hi-fi is a side thing. But,
right.
So 1978, I opened a hi-fi store in Santa Monica, California, in my apartment only in Los Angeles. It's like a heck of a trend. There were like 20 other apartment only dealers that copied me over the next couple of years. The LA Times Classifieds used to be an amazing dynamic every week, kind of a venue for what was going on in hi-fi in the late 70s, which was really the peak of the culture of everybody wants a hi-fi.
Yes.
That will never come back to the same degree, I don't think, but we have had a resurgence in the 21st century after the long decline in the last 20
years. Vinyl
years.
has probably helped that a little bit as well, and the resurgence of for the love of vinyl. And
well, vinyl numbers look impressive, but they're pathetic compared to what cassettes and vinyl used to sell.
Yeah, sure.
Just the fact it's going up.
It's relative, and it's introducing a younger audience into it, young people.
But not vinyl. Because of sound. It's a complete misreading of
course,
records can sound good.
Yeah.
It's not by any means saying that records don't have some significant advantages, but they also have some significant disadvantages. But playing music is on purpose, not sound quality, is what drove the vinyl revolution and the sheer numbers.
Yeah.
As we went from, 50% of the market was pre-recorded cassette at the time that CD came out. It was already only half the market was records and LPs, and the other half was cassette. Portable is the only thing that really has changed the audio world in my lifetime. It was the Walkman.
Yeah.
The Walkman meant that within a few years of its invention, a kid could go down to the drugstore, at least in sort of American retail, I'm not sure to say the druggist or not in this country, and for the price of 3 cassette tapes, buy the entire music delivery system, music directly injected into their brain without anybody telling them to turn it down, except when they wanted to talk to them.
Yeah.
Turn it down. But that was a different paradigm than growing up wanting the turntable receiver and a pair of speakers.
Sure.
But nothing else, no other invention since then has changed the nature of what we do. And people do not get higher or more immersed on their music today than they did in the 60s.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that a 60s hi-fi sounds the same as a hi-fi today.
No.
But the job of creating an opportunity for the individual to be naked in front of the music and be vulnerable and be controlled by that amazing power, there is no progress. That's a constant. So that's one of the conundrums of our world, is how can there be so much progress and we spend so much thought and energy and money curating our audio systems, or not choosing that house because you could never get it to sound good, or these are important. And yet I'm saying there's no progress. It's a moving phenomenon, and everything does matter, but the result is actually not changed.
How did you move along that scale to the point that you were growing AudioQuest to a bigger and bigger concern?
Well, during that appointment-only store starting in 78, I'd had an appointment-only store in Oregon earlier in the 70s, and had been one of the first and largest SoundStage dealers in the country, back when the only thing they made was the LP12, and it was $290 US when I started to sell it. Dollars were different.
Yeah.
World was different. But when I was essentially a failure as a rep and survived by selling my samples in the LA Times Classifieds, I went back into retail, and Cost Electrostatic, Rogers, Meridian, Lynn's on Deck, Denon, Celestion product in my living room. And I wanted a better cable for myself, for my store. Cable had been kind of, I refer to the opening gun of the cable market in the United States, for those of us who lived at the bleeding edge of audio, was 1976, when Polk, the speaker company, who are not thought of as adventuresome today, but at the time, Sandy Gross and Matt Polk, and the third partner, that it was a tweaky little company that did not exhibit at CES, but at the Bismarck Hotel, the off-site kind of thing. And they imported a cable from Japan that they called Cobra cable, which is a very high capacitance, low inductance, braided magnet wire cable, based on, I think, a ridiculous theory of impedance matching for speaker cable. That doesn't work. But nevertheless, it was sonically very interesting. It was some major advantages over anything that anybody else was using at the time, when it didn't blow up the amplifier. And that became a paradigm that others copied. A disc washer, Bruce Meyer, very smart fellow, brought out smog lifters, which was a bunch of twisted pairs together, high capacitance cable. And there were others at the time. Jonas Miller Sound in Beverly Hills was one of the four predominant high-end dealers in the United States. John Garland in San Jose, Paul Heath in Rochester, New York. Why Rochester? Because that's where he was. And Lyric Hi-Fi in Manhattan. And Jonas Miller had someone working for him, Ken Kreisel, the K in M&K, which is still a company today, Miller and Kreisel. And Ken chose a Mogami cable, which is like saying Belden or Canary. It's a competent manufacturer, mostly to the professional community. He chose a cable that had electrical characteristics similar to that Polk cable. Very high capacitance, low inductance. I don't know if they had the same 9 ohm characteristic impedance, but trying to be like a speaker, which I'm sorry is ridiculous. The output of your amplifier, especially for solid state, is hopefully nowhere near the 48 ohm nominal of your speaker. And speakers, it's nominal impedance. There's nothing to match. That's right. And you wouldn't want to. And if it did match, you'd be losing most of your power. You wouldn't want that either.
Right, it's up and down.
Match translation line allows you to go an enormous distance, but add a power loss. So be careful what you wish for.
Exactly.
Say, oh, this is the great idea. I think I'll use it over here. Might be detrimental. Another fellow in the area, Marina del Rey, Southern California, played with cables and brought me his airframe cable, which was silver over copper over steel, copper weld, that he made up his interconnects, and that was very provocative. And I was feeling around for what could I do special for my store. And I didn't have an idea myself, but because I was friends with all of the other specialty dealers in the area, an hour south of me in Anaheim, where Disneyland is located, was another appointment-only dealer, 3 people, Middleton, White, and Kemp, who sold out of a industrial park where they had a nice sound room. And they were friends with Dave Gore, who was a designer, electronics designer, a company called Quattro. He designed the Quattro Gain Cell DG250 amplifier. And he read an article in Hi-Fi News and Record Review in 1978 by Martin Collins, who himself had read an article by Jan Haraga in New Revue de Son in Paris, which was very disappointing when I met him because he was actually much too much of a technical guy, even though he got credit for being the first audio writer to write about cable. Was actually pretty narrow-minded, but he stimulated Martin Collins, who stimulated Dave Gore, who went down to the local medical cable supplier to buy some finely stranded Litz cable, according to the inclination of Martin Collins. So I got to tell Martin this story over lunch a few months ago in London. Martin, very nice guy.
Yeah.
And so Dave Gore took that cable down to Middleton White and Kemp. They attached two strands or two conductors to a doorknob and a drill, made a twisted pair, and compared it to the gigantic something welding cable, 800 strand, huge cable that they were using as their speaker cable. And this little 15 gauge cable just blew it away for clarity, openness, passed on the information. So they wanted to custom order a more appropriate version of that, a bigger version, 12 gauge version of that. And they invited me to split the order with them.
Okay.
And that's what I call original recipe.
Right.
Which actually did a whole bunch of things right. I was given this starting point. This has happened many times in my life where I'm not the one that had the original idea, but I responded to an opportunity or I noticed something. And we made that cable and I sold it in my little business and they sold it in their business. And then we thought, well, gee, it's kind of ugly when it's got this white nylon wrap around the conductor, because that was standard to the medical industry that the original cable had been made for. So we'll put a clear PVC jacket on it. Mm-hmm. And because it's magnet wire, which means it's insulated, strands, we'll make them red on one side and clear on the other side so you'll see the copper. Yeah. And it'll be kind of pretty, this twisted pair. And we did that, and that was cosmetically cool. Then Monster came out in 1979, and very finely stranded, not magnet wire, bare strands. The more strands you have, the worse it sounds, but that's a different story. But the cable, because it was so finely stranded and had a soft jacket, was, this is so friendly, it doesn't fight. That's kind of cool. We can do that too.
Yeah.
So we copied the soft jacket on the Monster cable, thinking we were just doing something that was a mechanical version of cosmetics, in a sense. And about a month later, after that cable had arrived, a friend of mine who was a speaker designer elsewhere in the LA basin said, hey, can you bring your cable down? I want to listen to it and consider whether I should use it inside my speakers. And I brought down some cable. We put it in his system, compared my cable to the Monster cable that he was using. And the difference, of course, my cable was a more expensive cable, so not completely fair, but it also was pretty dramatic. In those days, if you had speakers were over there, the electronics and the turntable were over by your listening position. There was no remote control.
Yeah.
So I brought in a long pair of cables, but the fellow had his system in the middle with short cables. So I went back out to the car and got a 3-meter pair cable, because 3 meters sounds a heck of a lot better than 8.5 meter. I'm sorry, speaker cable causes damage. The longer the cable, it's like a slowly going out of focus. It's not like every extra centimeter makes a difference. It's really a matter of percentages. Mm-hmm. If you compare 1 meter to a meter and a half, the difference is obvious. If you compare 10 meters to 15 meters, the difference is similarly obvious, not bigger.
Right.
It's a sort of a percentage thing. Yeah. I would purposely use short cables for development work because when the sound is more in focus, the character flaws of the cable are also more in focus.
Right.
So it's actually more obvious when the cable is unacceptable sounding. So short lengths.
Certain level of fine-tuning the sound based on the length of the cable that you're using.
Well, no. It's just the shorter the cable, the clearer the view towards what the cable is doing wrong.
Sure. So it allows you to make some changes.
So you're more encouraged to not, there's no smoothing.
Yeah.
It's in your face.
Yeah.
All cable is bad. It's just a matter of minimizing the damage. Cable does not ever make the sound better.
That's right.
So anyway, I went back with the 3-meter pair of cables and they didn't sound as good as the 8.5 meter pair of cables. Mm. And this was like, okay, black and white truth is that shorter is better. Why is the shorter cable worse? And that got my head racing, and it was pre-internet, so I'm not quite sure what it was that I managed to do in the next couple of days, but I came up with reading material about how in Japan, Pioneer, which was a very tricky company despite being known for making receivers, was putting conductor in a trough and filling it with epoxy to make it as rigid as possible.
Right.
Because whenever there are two strands carrying the same current, rule of rights dictates that with the same energy going through both of them, they attract.
Mm-hmm.
They don't repulse, they attract. But there's a mechanical motion and contact pressure is varying between the strands. It's a fairly complicated dynamic distortion mechanism driven by the modulation of the music. But I would never have thought of that.
Right.
But the soft jacket was like, I got to figure this out.
Right.
And then when I figure it out, do something about it.
Yes.
And the accident, or the fortunate experience, was making a cosmetic improvement and having the sound get worse, and then noticing that was worse, learning from that, and working continually while I still made stranded conductors for a few more years to use less strands, mingle in a few thicker strands to reduce the strand count, until I finally got to solid core. But it wasn't like I one day woke up and said, oh, now I'm going to make solid conductors. Yeah. It was an evolutionary process where I took a step at a time and sold all of my successful experiments while making progress towards better cable. Right. So mechanical stability was a very important ingredient. And I even sold the same cable with a PVC jacket called BC Bare Copper 4 and Type 4 with polypropylene insulation. The dielectric properties of polypropylene are superior. Pros and cons in an interconnect if it's not properly formed as a dielectric. But mechanically, the polypropylene was the cheapest way for me to use an appropriate material that was rigid.
Sure.
And the cable was obnoxious and stiff and sounded black and white superior to the PVC version. Mm-hmm. At around the same time, a friend of mine who I was repping his subwoofer, he had been a salesman working for me when I was in Portland, was selling a big giant coffin of a subwoofer. And he said, can you just take that twisted pair cable you make and take 4 of those conductors and put them in a spiral? And we'll double the gauge, and that'll be a suitable cable for me to sell with my woofer. And I said, sure, I'll make it. So I had the cable made, and I then listened to that 4 conductor, which I hooked up in a standard star quad, which is something microphone cables have done for years, compared to the 2 twisted pairs run separately. Same 4 conductors, but 2 twisted pairs versus the star quad. And the star quad is black and white superior.
Okay.
And that was the beginning of my awareness of geometry. I knew nothing. I really knew nothing. I was a babe in the woods, which either means I was ignorant and stupid for getting into this, or I had the gigantic advantage of never making the mistake of misapplying something from RF considerations or other types of data that didn't apply, at least they're not equally, within the very strange world of low-frequency analog audio. High-frequency engineers look at 20 to 20,000 cycles and say, nothing goes wrong. It's too simple.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it's a 10-octave bandwidth with a whole bunch of problems that don't happen when you're modulating a single high frequency with a very wide bandwidth. The whole other set of problems there that are very real and just as challenging, but they don't map one to the other particularly well. There's overlap, but overlap, not symmetry, I might say. And so I had multiple experiences that I was not looking for that came up and bit me. Directionality. I had my head in the sand, and that's not fair to ostriches, because ostriches do not put their head in the sand to hide from anything. That's a human meme that we know what we mean, but it's not fair to ostriches. But the British magazines were starting to talk about directionality, and I said, I don't understand it, and what a pain in the neck it would be to have to worry about it. And I didn't. I'm guilty for a little while at least. And then I made one of my first installation cables for in-wall use, where there are codes for requiring, low smoke and it's for the safety of firefighters. It doesn't really matter if your house is burning; it's for the safety of the firefighters. And at that time, the materials available was a very hard PVC, kind of unfriendly, not as hard as the polypropylene that I was using on that other cable. So when I made that cable with the same stranded conductor as those 2 other models that didn't have that outer jacket, I expected the performance to be in between. based on the hardness of the jacket. But when I first went to listen and to verify that, the softer jacket or the middle jacket sounded better than the hardest of the jackets. Like there's some other variable that's more important than the one that I was already paying attention to that was overruling the one that I was paying attention to. And it took about a day to figure out, to be provoked and experiment and realize that was directionality.
Right.
And then a day after that, I started marking our spools of cable with a green label that said to use the cable in the direction of the print, or a red label that said to use the cable in the direction that was opposite the print, because I had not controlled the print on the cables. But I had something that I could then immediately use as a put on the spools and offer a more predictable, superior product by painting. And so that was in a way my life, with a little bit of imagination. Some years later, I was making a cable that had the Clear and the Dragon, the first version of Dragon silver cable speaker. There were 20 gauge conductors, which is 0.813 millimeter diameter, which is the biggest that a conductor can be before there are audible problems due to skin effect, which is another
topic altogether.
And so it's 20 conductors that were all the maximum size. And I knew that the more conductors you have, the more they're interacting, and that's the source of distortion. And it costs more to extrude insulation over 20 conductors than over, say, 16 conductors. And I already was familiar with and appreciated what's called the bypass effect, like for a loudspeaker very often, or on the rail fuses in electronics or something, and put a little 0.01 capacitor in parallel with their big electrolytic. And for a controllable, affordable cost, you can get much of the performance of that 0.01, just even though the majority of the job is being done by some much bigger, lower quality capacitor. And I'd been familiar with that from putting small caps on rail fuses and in speakers, in my the previous 10 years. So I thought, well, if I have 8 conductors that are the 20 gauge, the size that you need, then I can probably get away with having 8 of the conductors be 18 gauge, 1 millimeter diameter, which by itself doesn't sound very good. There's obvious skin effect induced distortion. And it'll be a little less expensive to make. It'll have less interaction between conductors. It should be just a little better sounding. And I hope it's not worse, but I had the confidence to go ahead and order the cable that way. And then it was significantly better. And dealers, I didn't tell dealers what I'd done. Dealers listened and said, "What did you do? Why is this cable so much better than the last one you sent?" As long as I go in the right direction, nobody ever complained about change.
Sure.
Well, salespeople did. Reps don't like change, but the stores, give me more.
They wanted more.
And so I came up with an analogy to video, which at that time was cathode ray tube,
right?
And sharpness or artifacts. You turn up the artifacts. It's like stage makeup. If you're far enough away from the actress, she looks incredible until you see her backstage and you realize how ugly the stage makeup is. So sharpness on a CRT would enhance the perception of image clarity as long as you were far enough away. And thought, okay, different size strands all have a sonic signature. 20 gauge and smaller, the sonic signatures are equal but different, not counting if it's voltage, if it's interconnect, if it's impedance, carrying current to speaker cable, then the smaller is not as good. But if it's voltage, then you can get away with quite a bit smaller without that being what you're hearing. It's not the difference of impedance, but in the sound of that radially symmetrical conductor. And radially symmetrical is crucial because I totally don't like the sound of rectangular solid core or ribbon cables, the very uneven distribution of current, and you really hear the damage, the coloration that causes to a signal, and to the behavior dissipating RF. The story's going too fast, not giving you a chance. So I came up with this analogy that each conductor had a sound, and it was like, here's the correct edge for a visual image, and here's an artifact. And you might have multiple artifacts, which happened with some computers competing cable where they had a silver conductor and a copper conductor, and they were different sizes. And what I kind of realized, well, like with dither in digital, if I put the different gauge sizes very close together, not having a big gauge and a little gauge like, say, Tower Labs did, or some of the other things that Kimber still does, that if they were close together, I could not reduce distortion, but I could reduce the awareness of distortion. Mm-hmm. So if there's a proper edge and an artifact, well, that artifact is now distortion. But if a cluster of artifacts are very close to the correct line, sure, it's like losing a little bit of focus, but there isn't the mental distraction of a second sound. Mm-hmm. This is just sort of a visual analogy I made to give myself the confidence to think, well, maybe that's what I did that made more difference than I expected. And the next cable I made with 3 different sizes of conductor. And then the next cable with 4 different sizes of conductor, which is really as much as is worth doing. And those are the same 4 sizes of conductor that are in the Dragon cable today.
Okay.
And this is what I was doing in the mid-90s.
Sure.
So I laid this foundation that when I hired Garth Powell to design my power products in 2012, and he was already using AudioQuest cable and liked it, but he'd never thought about it. Mm. But now working for me, he investigated everything about my cables. Took him a week to figure out what directionality actually was, because I was being the pure scientist who, getting back to directionality, hey, the story has a... So I did not understand the mechanism, but if you can hear the difference, why wouldn't you use the cable in the direction that sounds better?
Exactly. So,
but engineers don't do that. Or I should say what I call vocational engineers. But like with any other vocation, there's brilliant people and there are people who barely, got a D in class. But when I was invited to Stenning back some time ago when B&W research facilities were still in Stenning, I was invited to meet with all their engineers in the afternoon for the purpose of being hopefully productively provocative. Mm-hmm. And I used directionality as an example of the kind of empirical evidence that needs to be acknowledged whether or not you understand it. Mm-hmm. That audio is an accumulation of values that need to go together. The best designers, especially in the world of speakers, which are the worst part of a hi-fi system, there needs to be solid engineering. There needs to be acknowledgement of empirical evidence and managing the results, even if you don't understand them, which is science. Mm-hmm. In science, there are no facts, only theories that haven't been proven wrong yet. Mm-hmm. Whereas to an engineer, there are only facts. Right. They're really very different. They're both important parts of civilization, but they are different starting points.
Yes.
And then because the ear-brain system, and for all animals, we're not designed to be historians, or evolutionary pressure does not make us, does not value accurately observing the world. We cope with the world. And so we are highly distorted in the way we perceive the world in ways that contribute to fight or flight and stay alive, to eat and reproduce. Mm-hmm. And so it's a complicated series of cheats over the 50 milliseconds it takes for sound before it hits between hitting our microphone, being processed by a combination of ingredients in our brain, memory, predictive algorithms, basically, and imagination. And then within about 50 milliseconds, we're given an oral image. The visual process takes about 200 milliseconds. There's more data. It's more complicated. So we actually live in the past. We don't really live in the present. Not quite like watching the sun go down and know that happened 8 minutes ago.
So obviously there was an evolving set of parameters that you were looking at, and a formula was developing.
Well, more touch points were developing, more tools in my toolkit, more things to pay attention to.
Sure.
A process that's still in place today. It's not like it's ever over.
Yeah.
But humans only know this much. It's amazing what we know.
Sure.
We don't know very much.
But yes, okay. So AudioQuest is in an industry that obviously, there's an abundance of cable manufacturers, and they may all have gone through a similar process that you went through, maybe not that far back as you, but obviously at some stage they went through several processes, and they were examining aspects of cable design and fine tuning and evolving. So what do you think? And we'll keep it short because we're running out of time. What do you think is the formula that separates AudioQuest from the hundreds, literally hundreds of cable manufacturers? And there's I guess there's a smaller number of big cable manufacturers. You know, you can say Nordost. There's a number of other companies that are fairly large cable manufacturers, but there's also a myriad smaller companies. What do you think differentiates what you're doing or what your AudioQuest is doing from those companies?
Well, the fact that I'm bigger than the next half dozen put together has to do with taking it to the street and making my product useful to more and larger retailers, or even to say Dish Satellite Company. My second largest customer in the world is Dish, selling an 8-foot HDMI cable to a percentage of the 23,000 satellite installations they do. So in terms of size of company, that's something that nobody else in the specialty audio market does.
Right.
They live they stay within their lane, so to speak, and I didn't. But within the being one of the original high-end companies, one of our special, what we call summit level dealers in New York City last year made a comment about how nice it was to see AudioQuest getting into high-end cable. And I said, I practically invented the category. My $163 interconnect in 1980 was the most expensive interconnect in the world, as far as I'm aware. Not that it did joy in charging a lot of money, but it was a very sophisticated cable, especially for its time, and the ingredients that went into it and the topology and what I was paying attention to. I still think I am better protected from making mistakes because I am ignorant. I'm not completely ignorant. I've learned a lot in my world, but a real education in a category means you know much more than you will ever apply. And you pull from that the ingredients that then give you perspective to talk about, you know, what it was like for that person to be a prime minister or a president, if it's history or something in science. But there's a larger body of knowledge. I believe in liberal arts education, which is not about learning what you've learned, but learning how to learn. But having a large repertoire and connection points to then pull from. So somebody talking to me about cable might think that I must be an engineer, I know so much. No. If my products were the result of an engineering perspective, then I would know 10 times more than I know. I only know what I know because it's what's relevant in the world that I was pursuing. And yes, I picked up some fuzz around the edges and some details, but it is remarkable to now work with Garth as an autodidact and an absolutely brilliant. When do you apply the word genius? I don't know, but as far as I'm concerned, he's a genius. And that comes at a price that we all are weird in our way. And because I kind of felt embarrassed, I got over the embarrassment of saying, well, what credentials do you have that allows you to design cable? And really, I continue to see to this day that one of the most fundamental advantages, and Garth shares this, despite being a competent engineer who worked and studied with some of the greatest analog engineers, just old enough, he's still younger than me, but just old enough to work with many of the last of the greatest analog engineers, because the engineers coming out of school today, it's all digital. And they weren't forced to confront the vagaries and the awkwardnesses of analog, which are still with us. Because even the transmission of a digital signal the data might be digital, but the signal is analog. Subject to everything that's ever gone right or wrong with analog.
Sure.
Basically, it's the noise that's happening at the same time. So Garth could look at something like my invention of the dielectric bias system and know immediately that I was not optimizing it because I was dielectrically biasing the positive and the negative. Because when I had the idea and ran my first experiment, I biased the whole cable, and wow, the result was clear benefit. So I did it. I did not have the knowledge, which is so rudimentary to someone like Garth, to know that I was optimizing the positive dielectric and I was actually doing something negative to the negative dielectric.
You had a freedom, in other words, to come up with that idea because you weren't looking at that from a trained engineering perspective. You were looking at it on a more experience,
An explorer, a blind explorer, feeling my way around in the dark.
Sure. Yeah.
Gar said I shouldn't say that's too diminutive, but that's how kind of I felt in a world where everybody else knew more than I did. Someone like Dave Caruso, who's doing a very good job. Sorry, it was Audio by Caruso, Dave Sauls. Wire World is one of my more legitimate competitors. Dave was the tech at a Miami hi-fi dealer called Audio by Caruso, who sold my cables in the early 80s. And that prompted Dave to play with cables. Right? But his theory of cables is very different. And the difference is that he is, to my mind, misapplying things he understands that happen at other frequencies that I don't even know enough to misapply. Matthew Bond, who's a good friend of mine, and one of the only designer who's done some things with cable that I learned from.
Australian.
Sorry?
An Australian.
Yes, he is in Australia. I first met him when he first came over to the U.S. Before Tower Labs, he was selling Apogee cassette tapes, premium cassette tapes.
Okay, yeah.
But very, very nice guy, humble, a wonderful person. I have great respect for. And like I said, he's the only one who's made cables that gave me a bit of a poke and taught me something. Right. But even today, as I look at his new Matthew Bond limited cables, I want to say, like, Matthew, you were going the right way. Why did you go and do this thing where now you're making this very high capacitance, low inductance cable, like where Polk started in 1976? We all do the best we can.
Sure.
So I don't prize being ignorant, but I prize the opportunity that it gave me. I often say that knowledge is like sculpting, and the people were to make the analogy most of us would make without having thought about it too much would be that gaining knowledge is like sculpting with clay, where you add material in order to create whatever the shape is that you want to sculpt. But when you sculpt with stone or with wood, you're doing the opposite. You're taking away material.
Yes.
You are taking away opportunity. And human language is like that. We all start out able to speak any language in the world. And then we learn not to.
Yeah.
We learn that it's not it's the big red ball, not the red big ball.
Yes.
And it's just lots of things that are buried that we don't even think about.
Sure.
But that involves throwing away more possibilities than the ones that we keep.
Yeah.
And so knowledge is, a building of knowledge is also an elimination of possibility at the same time. It's a conundrum.